Welcome to the Art of Poetry. This is the 24th show of the Art of Poetry, and the title of this program is Poems That Tap You on the Shoulder. First, I want to thank Frank Crowley, the Chief Program Director for the show, that's not here today. He is the host and producer of the Art of Poetry. His creativity, expansive eye, outreach, and enthusiasm for poetry in all its incarnations keep this program going and growing strong. Meanwhile, this month, Frank invited me to take a slot in the April Month of Poetry presentation, and my first choice as co-host is, may I introduce Mark McGuire Schwartz. Hi, Mark.
Howdy.
Mark is, among many things, a poet in the Mark McGuire Schwartz School of Poetry, who explores and expresses, among many other things, the fine details of absurdity in the human experience, the resonance of mathematics in our daily lives, the importance of paying attention and responding to our current reality, and notably, Mark is the creator of The 17, a form of poetry attempted by many and mastered by Mark, in which 17 elements conspire to tap you on the shoulder. Mark is also the editor of Circumference, an e-zine poetry publication. He is a professor who teaches English and poetry at the university level. I first met Mark many years ago when he hosted, along with two co-hosts, the Poetry Institute at the Institute Library in New Haven, a long-lasting monthly featured reader and open mic event. What I came to appreciate most about Mark was that of the three, he was the most active listener. He was not there to show and tell poetry. He was there to absorb and learn and find resonance.
You ever said that before?
Well, there you go. These same qualities make a great teacher and a wonderful friend. So, Mark, what do you got for us today?
First, after I stop blushing, I should mention, you said I invented the 17 form of poetry. I also invented the number 17.
Oh.
Before I did that, people went from 16 right to 18.
Wow.
And they were just, so,
well, that is,
that's...
the prime number. Good for you.
It is prime, yeah. That's why it costs more. What I got for us? Well, we were thinking of poems and poems that just kind of say, hello, hi, we have something for you. And poets are, if I can say so, are an odd bunch. And sometimes we don't talk to people, or we have things that we don't say to people because we think, I don't know what we think. But sometimes we have to put it down in writing and let the writing then sneak up on someone and say, hey, here's something important. And an old poem that everyone knows is Richard Cory. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him, and he was a gentleman from Salt to Crown, etc. And it's just, and Edwin Arlington Robinson wrote many of these poems. They're almost gossip poems. The poems about people. And but here's something I've noticed about someone that I want to emphasize. So here we see Richard Cory. That's what he's telling us in the first line. And later it's going to tell us, but there's more than we see. There's more. Richard Cory is very rich, but the nature of being rich may not be what we think it is. And his life may not be as enviable. In the line, in everything, it makes us wish we were in his place. But by the end, you know that's not the case. So that's an early tapper. Shoulder tapper.
For you, that was one of the first memorable poems that tapped you?
Yeah, that actually goes way back in my relationship to poetry.
That's pretty deep. So, one of mine one of my first poems that tapped me on the shoulder was an Emily Dickinson poem, I Am Nobody, Who Are You? And it's so short, I'll read the whole thing. Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell, that advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. So at the time I read it, I was quite, young. I was probably, preteen, and but I thought, well, why wouldn't you want to be somebody? Why wouldn't you want to be somebody? And it kind of convinced me, well, maybe there's an upside, a downside to everything. And the more I noticed about people who were trying hard to be somebody, the more I realized that they did seem like they were croaking out their own importance. So it grabbed me right away.
So that poem happens to be in this book, An Invitation to Poetry, edited by Robert Pinsky and Maggie Dietz. And this book, if you know An Invitation to Poetry, or if you know that one, which is the same book, only blue, it comes with a DVD. Or you can watch the videos online. So you can see a video of a young woman reading that poem. And she's a very, very accomplished young woman. She really, and thinking about being nobody. So it's interesting. And
just like me.
Yes, exactly like you. Gemma is a very accomplished young lady.
Young lady.
But Emily Dickinson, she struck me as a shoulder tapper also. And everyone knows about Emily Dickinson, that she led this quiet, secluded life where she did not travel much. In later years, she didn't travel much beyond her own room, or beyond her own house or the garden. But even in that small space, she had big ideas. Including with this line sort of hits me, because the first line of this poem, because it starts out small and then jumps to large right within that first line. First part of it is, I heard a fly buzz. Ordinary enough. It could be it's sitting in her house or out in the garden. The rest of it is, when I died. The everyday thing, the fly buzzing. And now we're talking about eternity and life and what happens after death. And she does that. She does see the frogs and the bees, and she writes about butterflies, and many, many poems mention those insects. And the little one was, fame is a bee. What do you mean, fame is a bee? It catches me because it's, I don't know how fame is a bee. And until I read these few lines. Fame is a bee, it has a song, it has a sting, too, it has wing, it has fame. And her work is sort of quiet that way. And not all her work, but it does have a gentleness to it. Whereas her contemporary, Walt Whitman, was so bold and so loud, and he just, and he also looked for big ideas in a very different way. As Emily Dickinson stayed home, he liked to travel, he liked to go places, like great poem, Song of the Open Road, about him. But he takes here's a line that sort of jumps out at you. Now, these guys were both so far ahead of the thinkers of their time in so many ways. And Whitman says, death is different than what anyone supposes, and luckier. That's, whoa, talking about death being lucky.
Huh.
That's, gives you something to start with. It gives you something that he's tapped me on the shoulder, and I respond, what are you talking about? Why, how is it lucky to have death? And that's all I have. Oh, no, what do you got?
Well, our recent poet laureate, Joy Harjo, the world begins at a kitchen table. Oh, it's called Perhaps the World Ends Here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. Okay, we can be there. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation and will go on. We chase chickens and dogs away from it. Okay, now we're talking about an experience that might not be everyone's kitchen table, but we'll go with it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh at us, at our poor falling down selves as we put ourselves back together once again at this table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table, and have prepared our parents, and we have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at this kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. So this one tapped me on the shoulder because I get a sense of this is where the family centers itself. And I remember in my own youth, the family centered itself at a kitchen table. We didn't have animals running around, but we did have more things than just serving food happening at that table. People gathering to talk about important things, or to listen to one of the grandmothers tell a story, and so on and so on. And but perhaps the world ends here means that even though there are other things now that distract our focus, the kitchen table, or that sense of focusing around a meal and a family, still has some permanence. That's one of the things.
And maybe as soon as you leave the kitchen table, you've left what is important. Mm-hmm. You've left the real world.
Right.
In some ways.
That's
so I'm thinking of the poets. You know, why they say these things that Langston Hughes is in a train, and he's riding, and the train is crossing a bridge over the Mississippi, and he starts, and by all reports, he did this very quickly on a piece of scrap paper. He writes, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like rivers. I've bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above it. I heard the singing of Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. And that's a young man who apparently has known the rivers of all the world for all time. And how do we know things? I mean, Emily Dickinson again talks about how she knows things she hasn't seen. You know, I haven't seen the ocean, but I know what a wave is like. So I think one of the things poets are telling us every time they tap us on the shoulder is, don't let life just pass you by. Look closely at flies buzzing, crossing this mighty river, the Mississippi. And what if rivers meant to civilization and to individuals, all these see, I shouldn't speak because words don't actually,
Millennia?
yeah, look at that. All this time.
Right. There's a poem that also, it focused me on what I love about certain memories I like to have, even though the experiences were brief. And I come back to them again and again. And the title of this poem caught me before I even read it. I sensed I was going to have to dive into it, because the title is Catalpa, and it's by John Ciardi. And John Ciardi was a poet who took the idea of being a gardener and having to clean the junk out of his yard that the catalpa tree shed, and pointed to the value of how nature changes, and the beauty of things is often that they are ephemeral, that what we experience we have to keep experiencing in our mind because the reality is soon lost, but the memory holds. So this is, the catalpa's white week is ending here in the corner of my yard. It has its arms full of its own flowering now, but the least air spills off a petal and a breeze lets fall whole coronations. There is not much more of what this is. Is every gladness quick? The tree's a nuisance, really. Long before the summer's out, its beans, long as a stick, will start to shed. And every year one limb cracks without falling off and hangs there dead till I get up and risk my neck to trim it, what it knows how to lose but not to shed. I keep this tree only for one white pass. The end of June is its garden, July its fall. All else, the world remembering what was and the 7 days of its visible miracle. What should I keep if averages were all? And that last line just, boom, it just hits you. And recently, a woman that I know, she and her husband moved to a smaller home where they could walk from the city to, from their neighborhood to the town. And they had a catalpa tree in their backyard. And she goes, oh, I have this horrible tree. It has all these horrible things, and I don't know, maybe we should have it cut down. And I said, no, no, no. And I actually showed her the poem, and she said, oh. And she is a person who loves poetry and expression and thought. So it, it gave her an insight into the ephemerals. I don't know if it tapped her on the shoulder when I shoved it at her. It was more like, but it tapped me on the shoulder of why I loved it for so many years since I was a child. I didn't have to do the cleaning up, my parents did, but I remember how it smelled. And I remember playing with the beans, because there's lots you could do with those things.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, so we seem to have touched upon the theme of how nature and how gardening and how humans' relationship with more natural things, which reminds me of a poem I love by Stanley Kunitz, who was an avid gardener for all his life. And here's a poem that it's an interesting poem because there's some knowledge in it It teaches you something about the life cycle of a hornworm. But it also presents empathy in a different way. Because we'll start, the first lines all run together. There are many lines in the first sentence called Hornworm Autumn Lamentation. Since the first morning when I crawled into the world a naked, grubby thing, and found the world unkind, my dearest faith has been that this is but a trial, I shall be changed. So, it's not about Stanley Kunitz. He did not crawl into the world a grubby, naked. He crawled into the world a naked thing, but not a grubby thing. And we all change, but the voice is that of the hornworm. The hornworm is the narrator of this poem. And he sees things. Hornworms, of course, are enemies of gardeners, particularly of tomato gardeners. They attack, at least some types of hornworm attack the tomato plants. And so Kunitz, as a gardener, would naturally not be kind to a hornworm, but he stops and thinks, what is a hornworm's point of view? Does the hornworm have some place in this world? Does it deserve to live? And the hornworm confronts him philosophically. And as I say, it also talks about all the things a hornworm goes through, which is, it's not an easy life. If you were thinking of becoming a hornworm, it's... but the hornworm pleads for mercy. So he says, the last ending of the poem is, "Sir, you with the red snippers in your hand, hovering over me, casting your shadow, I greet you, whether you come as an angel of death or of mercy. But tell me, before you choose to slice me in two, who can understand the ways of the great worm in the sky?" So
that's a great swerve.
Yeah, and I think it seems, I'm guessing this experience actually happened to Kunitz. He actually came across a talking hornworm, or he actually at least thought it through, before he did snip it in half. Right. And I think that's what poets like to tell us. Maybe there's a different way, something we haven't thought of before. So,
right.
Come, let me tell you about something I just learned.
A different way of examining things.
So.
Right. Very good. When you write yourself, do you start out with an idea of an urge to tap people on the shoulder, or are you just getting things out and it works out that way, or what's it like for you?
That's a good question. Oh, I hate it when people say, like, that's a good question.
We're on NPR.
That's whatever. I guess that's just a way to stall because you don't know the answer. I don't, I'm not sure. I should have brought some of my poems. I would have looked at them. But
we'll just have to have you back.
I have, there are things that I have to say. And then that's something I would say to, hi, Paul, how are you having a nice walk? Let me tell you about something. It's not something I'd say in casual conversation. It's not something, there's a thought in there, a notion in there. And, poems sort of have two elements. Like songs do. I mean, the song has the melody and the words, and a poem has ideas, and it has a structure, a wordplay of some sort, whether it's a form or whether it's any of the many devices, rhyming, alliteration, use of a strange diction.
Repetition.
Yeah, there's so many different ways a poem can sometimes a poem just breaks right into.
Yeah. Well, how about if we pick that up on the second half, and we could talk more about how we tap people on the shoulder a little bit, and then go back.
Sounds good.
Okay. So we're done with our first half, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Now we have to do the
As a scientist, I know by the time she takes her first breath, 9 billion more tons of carbon pollution will be in the air. When she takes her first steps, wildfires will have burned millions more acres she could have explored. By the time a child born today goes to college, it may be too late to leave them the world we promised. Our window to act on climate change is like watching them grow up. We blink and we miss it.
Put a frog in a pot of boiling water and it'll jump right out. But put a frog in a pot of cool water and slowly heat it up, and that frog will boil. As veterans, we can tell ourselves the lie that it's easier to stay in that boiling water, to disconnect. But you've never been interested in easy. You are not a frog.
Find resources at va.gov/reach.
So we were having a conversation about how poetry is more than having a conversation just with someone casually. And this is kind of meta, but I'd like to continue the conversation a little bit about how poetry is not just a conversation.
Right. And there's a poem I brought to share.
Oh, please.
So this is a very short poem by Jane Kenyon. And I think that this is something that, well, I think, and this, another poem I'm not going to share. There's a famous poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And she's out on having a good time with a friend, and they would go up on a hilltop, and then we were young and we were merry, and we rode back and forth all night on the ferry. And they bought apples and pears. And
oh, right, the old woman,
It's a very simple thing. It's something people do. But somehow it rose to more than that for her. So she, somehow she said, I can't just say, hey, I had a nice time. And she probably said that, Her cousin called and she said, oh yeah, I had a nice time. We went back and forth in the ferry. But then she used her technique and used, it's a rhyming poem. It has a set meter and used the techniques because she wanted to make it something more. There's maybe some magic there. Maybe there's something that the poet doesn't even know, but there's something.
Right.
And then here's Jane Kenyon, which I was going to before you interrupted me. Oh, wait, no, I interrupted me. I'm sorry. I knew it was one of us. Finding a long gray hair. I scrub the long floorboards in the kitchen, repeating the motions of other women who have lived in this house. And when I find a long gray hair floating in the pail, I feel my life has been added to theirs. So when I called up Jane that day, I said, well, what did you do today? And she said, oh, I scrubbed the floor. Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, okay, Jane, that's nice. I hope you also eat supper. It sounds so ordinary.
Right.
But in doing it, and she finds a hair. We all have hair. Well, some of us have less than others. But something in that little action of scrubbing the floor and finding a hair, There's actually something that looks like glass on this floor. Don't step on it. In scrubbing the floor and finding that hair, she thinks about the nature of how women have been all these ages, and how she is part of that community of women who you know, I think men have scrubbed floors once or twice. We try. We do our best. Yeah. But this very simple act, I think, there's something that becomes more important. And that's when it taps her. The act has tapped her, and she has tapped me. In a way, every time I read that poem, I'm moved. I think, what is it, 5 lines or something? So how about you? When you write a poem, is it?
Well, when I write a poem, it's usually, I think I'm writing a poem about something that happened to me or something that I'd like to share. But it's always I know it sounds corny, but it's always a process of discovery where at the end of the poem I realize how I felt about something, and I didn't even know that I felt that way at the beginning of the poem. So the poem kind of morphs or veers off into its own thing.
Right.
Not what I set out to write at all. I may have started to write about visiting the Emily Dickinson house, but I ended up talking about my granddaughter who was really trying to figure out the nature of people and if they can isolate themselves or if being around people is a part of life, and how much to believe of what other people say of people. Right. Even. So it becomes different than what I set out to do. It becomes an exploration or, yes. Yeah.
And when you have gone through that process, then you have 2 choices. And speaking of dumb things to say, you have 2 choices, as if there is not a world of many
choices. Yeah.
So, but you could choose to, okay, I'm going to design this poem now to be that. I went here, I went here, I went here. This is how I discovered this.
Yeah.
Or you could scrap the first 6 stanzas and go to the 7th one, which is what you have discovered. This is the heart of the poem. This is what I want to bring up front.
Right, right.
So, which
I have a hard time doing that. I really like settings. I really am a narrative poet.
Yes.
But I can see that less is better with that.
Well, I know we're not allowed to talk about that ugly thing. Prose.
Oh, right.
But when you're writing prose, I think, and I do teach composition as well as literature.
Thanks for.
And when you're writing prose, often people have no idea what they're writing about until they get to the 7th paragraph.
Oh, that's.
And in that case, often it is appropriate to just cut those first silly 6 paragraphs or condense them into 1. But on the other hand, we have this poem. See it? Philip Levine, What Work Is. And there are many poems that do this thing, which is you start out one place and then go somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. And I think this poem does it beautifully. It's a fairly long poem, so I'll just do a few bits of it. What work is. We stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. Forget you. This is about waiting. So he keeps tapping you on the shoulder.
Right.
First, it's narrative, so we're descriptive. If we're standing in the long line, okay, for work. And then it goes right to, it directs you directly. You know what work is.
So the poem is about work, but it's also about a thought process.
And
You're watching a thought process.
it is.
That's interesting, too.
And work turns out to be, the most important work turns out to be not about the work that he doesn't have, the employment, the earning a wage, because he sees someone up ahead. He says, oh, there's my brother. But it's not his brother. The shoulders are different. And then he starts talking about his brother who stays up all night. Maybe I got that. He has a strange sleep pattern so he can study the opera, to sing the opera of Wagner, which Philip Levine appropriately says, the worst music ever invented. But then Gemma.
We're going to have the opera people.
Then, in the end, it's about, he has switched that away, and it says, how long has it been since you told him you love him, held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide and said those words, and maybe kissed his cheek? And the very last line is, maybe you haven't done that because you don't know what work is. So work has become very personal work, interpersonal work. But the poem has wandered. It has taken this. I'm standing in line because I need a job. I think I see my brother. My brother does this. My brother, I did it. Here's my relation. It goes through all these steps before you get to the heart of the poem.
That's another good, I guess, way to write, you know.
It's one way.
Technique to use.
It worked for this.
So this book by Tracy K. Smith, Life on Mars, I was reading it at a bookstore once and I didn't buy it.
Yeah, you're shoplifting. You haven't broken that habit
I haven't broken that habit. Because I was supposed to be somewhere else and it was raining and I don't know, a bunch of other stuff. And Mark gave it to me for Mark and Mary Ellen, his wife, gave it to me for my birthday. And I was so surprised because I had totally forgotten about it. Life on Mars, the title struck me because, not just because Tracy K. Smith is a great poet, and this did win the Pulitzer Prize, but Life on Mars was a David Bowie song, and I loved that music at the time. But it tapped me on the shoulder for a variety of reasons, mostly being the content itself. The poem Life on Mars itself is several stanzas long, or parts long, I should say. And I'm just going to read you the last part. She talks about different memories of her father, but it all comes to a resolution in the last part where she says, when my father worked on the Hubble telescope, he said they operated like surgeons, scrubbed and sheathed in papery green, the room a clean, cold, bright white. He read Larry Niven, science fiction writer, at home and drank scotch on the rocks, his eyes exhausted and pink. These were the Reagan years, when we lived with our finger on the button and struggled to view our enemies as children. My father spent whole seasons bowing before the oracle, hungry for what it could find, this telescope. His face lit up whenever anyone asked, and his arms would raise as if he were weightless, perfectly at ease in the never-ending night of space. On the ground, we tied postcards to balloons for peace. Prince Charles married Lady Di. Rock Hudson died. We learned new words for things. The decade changed. The first few pictures of the Hubble telescope came back blurred, and I felt ashamed for all the cheerful engineers, my father and his tribe. The second time, the optics jibed. We saw to the edge of all there is. So brutal and alive, it seemed to comprehend us back. So this is her way of trying to come at the big picture. She gives all details of a certain time when this happened, when they saw the images, and all the details that she gives are of things that don't even exist anymore. Rock Hudson, Prince Charles married to Lady Di, of course, and the gestures people made, innocent gestures people made for peace that just didn't pan out because they didn't come with justice. And so no peace without justice. So tying balloons to postcards is something that I would have done back then too. I did many things like that. But this brings home that no, it's much bigger than that. We have to think bigger. And it just, it's a tap on the shoulder that you live in a certain time, but time goes on and the universe is so much bigger than that. And it's, I don't know, it really, the whole book, and this poem in particular, is, I don't know, I guess I'm making a little, no, find it at your library.
Yeah, and one of the great things about Tracy K. Smith is she thinks so big.
Yeah.
She's not only concerned about life here, but on Mars also. And another great thing is she uses the word jibed correctly, and so many people say jived when they mean jibed.
Oh.
So it's always good to hear it done correctly. But
I'm glad I pronounced it correctly.
Yes. So so there we have. In each of these books, there are many poems and many authors, and many great authors, and we could talk about all sorts of things. Do you have any in particular you'd like to go to? We have Auden, I have Howell, Ginsberg, I have Gerald Stern about being Jewish, Lucille Clifton about her sons.
So many choices. Why don't you just choose one, and I'll be happy to
Okay,
listen.
so this one.
I know. I was going to say you're a Ginsberg fan.
I am a Ginsberg fan, so forgive me for.
No,
But I just want to point out the beginnings of the three sections of Howell. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry, that jumps out at you, that taps you hard on the shoulder. And the poem is long lines a la that only Walt Whitman often does long lines like this. But and the poem races through, and we get to the second part, and it's talking about, and he's pulled back, and it was showing the larger picture, but not the first part. You see all these specific things you see, and then he goes, "What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed their skulls and ate their brains and imagination, Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans and unobtainable dollars," etc., etc. So he's not going to let you walk by without looking at this. And the third one, it's a little quieter, but still frantic and fast. And Carl Solomon, "I'm with you in Rockland." Sounds. "Where you're madder than I am. I'm with you in Rockland, where you must feel very strange, where you've murdered your secretaries, etc., etc." Yeah. So Those are big taps, I think.
Well, but at the time, the people were afraid to tap. You know, there weren't that many people tapping, as I remember.
There was, this is a breakthrough poem in many, many ways.
Yeah,
Talks about
that's good.
homosexuality.
That breakthrough. That's a good.
It talks about, just and just the naked honestness, his break from academia, as both in the poetic form and what he has to say.
I want you to maybe read the one about the Jewish experience, because that's something that hasn't been explored much on this.
Well, we'll give you a little taste of Gerald Stern, who, being Jewish, I mean, I understand this in a way. I'm not sure everyone. It's called behaving like a Jew. So when I got there, the dead possum looked like an enormous baby sleeping on the road. It took me only a few seconds just seeing him there with a hole in his back and the wind blowing through his hair to get back again into my animal sorrow. That's how Jews behave.
Yeah.
We look at dead opossums. I'm going to be unappeased at the opossum's death. I'm going to behave like a Jew and touch his face and stare into his eyes and pull him off the road. I'm not going to stand in a wet ditch with Toyotas and Chevys passing over me at 60 miles an hour and praise the beauty and the balance and lose myself in the immortal life stream. For my, I am skipping here. There's some, let me finish the poem and then I'll come back to something. And my eyes still weak and misty from his round belly and curved fingers and his black whiskers and his little dancing feet. So, yes, that touches on being Jewish in a very tangential way. But in here he mentions Lindbergh. I'm sick of the spirit of Lindbergh over everything. And there's a footnote. And the footnote, it tells you that Charles Lindbergh made the first solo nonstop flight, which we all knew, and became later in life a spokesperson for the environmental causes. Lindbergh was also a terrible anti-Semite.
Yeah, you would think that that's what they would put in there.
Yeah,
wow.
But they put in that he made the flight that everyone knew anyway.
Not that I am a person with a lot of knowledge on cultures, but in my own experience, the Jewish acknowledgement of the death of a loved one is one of the most respectful, long-lasting, intentional ceremonies that I have ever attended, to honor the dead. And I think if that might be part of what is in that poem, or do you see it a different way?
No, and I think that's part of what's in the poem. And we could take it to the history of the Jews, including the Holocaust, and then relate it to the other famous Ginsberg poem, Kaddish, all about his mother and her death and her life. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So if we have a few more minutes to the end, I just want to read a poem, if I can find it.
I'd say we have probably 5 minutes or so left, I'd guess.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the peepers, the frogs.
The peepers, yes.
Who say, how dreary, how dreary to be somebody. Okay, this is from New Poets of Native Nations, We did a couple programs on Native nations, and this one never made the cut, and I liked it. It tapped me on the shoulder at the time. This is from Margaret Newton, and I cannot read the native language that it's in, but I'll read the translation. What the peepers say, after the winter waiting, no longer half frozen by design, our calling becomes all calling. Under the rippling bark, peepers have thawed to crawl into the swamp where my calling becomes your calling. A seismic seiche, a synaptic snowstorm of springtime repetition, and your calling becomes my calling. As we drift away on our echoes, we are the details, we are the distance, and all calling becomes our calling.
So many great poems. So we are supposed to wrap this up, but let's extend another 2 or 3 hours because we got stuff here. It's all so good.
Yeah.
How can you stop?
Well, we could just encourage to keep tapping ourselves on the shoulder and each other, and yeah.
So
You got one more, Mark?
well, we'll just talk a little bit about W.H. Auden. And
Okay, we'll end with Auden.
we had a couple of poems by him, but I'll do the famous one, the Musée des Beaux-Arts.
Oh, right.
So if you know the picture, and here it is. No, that's not it. He goes into this museum and he sees the Bruegel picture of Icarus falling. I think it's called Icarus falling. And if you see the picture, if you're just walking quickly through the museum, you say, oh, guy, farmer, he's plowing his farm, and there's a dog, and there's some sheep, and there's a ship. Nice little picture. But if you stand there and you look and you say, oh, wait a minute, you read the title, it's Icarus falling, you say, wait a minute, where's Icarus?
Right, he's not even, he would be smaller than the O in the of this picture.
One of the blades of grass.
Yeah, one of the blades, that's how big it is.
And so Auden, it taps Auden on the shoulder, and when he writes about it, he talks about Icarus in the very end of the poem. But in the beginning, he says, about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood the human position. And so he's found something bigger. And it's all about a poet finding a little spark of magic and wanting to share it.
Yeah.
So.
I think poets get tapped on the shoulder by other things, and that's the whole point of the ekphrastic poetry. And that's a fun thing to explore too as well. Maybe someday we'll do a whole show on that. That could
That
work.
would be fun.
Yeah. So, do you have any other thoughts about what could in exploring poetry, what could help us to find poems that tap us on the shoulder? Where would you look?
Well, I think we do this naturally. I think when we're reading, we find a poem and you go, whoa, and you got, poems have, the anthologies have, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say something bad about poetry, but there's a lot of junk in here. Or stuff that just is not as interesting to you at the time.
Right.
And you just keep reading and you find something jumps out at you.
So be a sleuth. Be your own sleuth. Be your own explorer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So keep reading. Keep being tapped.
Yeah.
And
Go
maybe
to
look
poetry
for
readings.
poems.
Go to poetry readings.
Ah, good thing to do.
Yeah. And anthologies are good. Libraries are good. And yeah. I guess that's our show for today. Thank you very much for being here, Mark.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Always fun to talk about poetry.
Yeah, you were here once before, right?
I was.
Yeah, quite a while ago. And
Actually, I've been I stayed in the, that was like 16 months ago, and I stayed in the building ever since, waiting for us to.
Okay, well,
Be
thank
on
you
again.
very much, and I guess we're a wrap.
Happy poetry.
Happy poetry, everyone.